My name's Kris Holm. I'm a mountain and trails unicyclist from Vancouver, Canada, and we're at Unicon 16 in Brixton, Italy.
First question would be simply, how long have you been unicycling for?
I've been riding for about just over 25 years now, around that, ever since 1986.
Wow.
Yeah, a little while.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's 2 years before I was even born. Just to make you feel better about yourself. How was it, how did you get started?
I got started because I saw a street performer. He was playing violin on a unicycle, performing. I thought that was kind of cool because I play the violin. So I asked for one for my birthday. But it turned out really that that was kind of a trick thing, and my family was really outdoorsy. We did a lot of hiking and skiing and climbing and that. So as soon as I could ride down the street, I started riding on trails and off-road.
That was the next question. How did you get into trails and beauty? How did it kind of develop? Obviously when you first started, you couldn't go online and watch all these videos of other people doing things. So.
No, you couldn't at all. And I was riding totally in isolation. I didn't know anybody that rode. But in all kinds of those kinds of adventure outdoor sports, usually the objective, the point of the sport is to negotiate some kind of terrain, whether that's kayaking down a river or skiing a slope or climbing a line. And so for me, the skills progression, once I started riding a unicycle, wasn't tricks so much or freestyle, which was, I guess, the most technical riding at that time. Yeah. It was to try to ride over something. And because I was already hiking on trails, it seemed natural to ride on them.
Of course, yeah.
So it was right from the beginning, like since I was 12, I started riding on trails. I also did a lot of rock climbing, and so it was the main thing I did on my rest days. When I was out on a climbing road trip, I just pull out the unicycle on the campsite and go ride.
Did you find it was quite good cross training at all?
Yeah, I did. I mean, mostly just because the two go together so well, I think, mentally. Especially trials. I mean, trials is bouldering, really. That's really all it is. It's just like climbing bouldering. And so if I was climbing lines, and I think the way you see too, particularly with trials, where when you see an obstacle, or you see a bench or something, as you know, you don't just see a bench, you see a line. And that's the same mentality you bring to as a climber when you're looking at a cliff, and someone who wasn't a climber would just see a cliff. And you're seeing that route, the holes here and there, and you're working your way through it. So that was part of it, and then the other part was just the aesthetics. In many ways for me, and partly because one of the reasons why I haven't gotten as much into flatland riding, for example, is that unicycling was kind of just an excuse to get outside, to go to outside of urban centers, to beautiful places, and explore around.
I think even to this day, everyone's kind of influenced by the area they grow up in, whether it be a city or as you said, the other activities that they're involved in.
I totally agree. Like, I think if you look at the people that are really strong in flatland, for example, and obviously there's exceptions to that, but they might be in an area that is perhaps more limited in terms of trials or uni, and so they develop what's their strength, whereas where I live, it has world-class trails, and I happen to live beside a beach that has amazing trials riding, and so just personally I was more motivated to go and ride.
Makes perfect sense. So you said you kind of grew up riding it in isolation, completely not with other people. What was the first event that you went to where you kind of met other people who did something, maybe not the same, but something similar to you, maybe unicycle?
I rode from 1986 all the way to 1998 without even knowing about the sport or anything to do with it. And it was only afterwards even that in hindsight I even thought about it as a sport. But I typed mountain unicycling into an internet search engine and found and I got results. I couldn't believe it. And so I went to the California Uni Weekend in '98, which was I think the third Uni Weekend. And that was the first time I'd ridden with other riders. And I was blown away. There was about 50 of us out there riding trails together. And that's what started to really get me motivated. And then that was kind of combined with living in a place that was a center for professional riding, and sort of drifting there.
So obviously, later on you were involved in a lot of Dan Heaton's filming, Universe 1, Universe 2, Defect. What was that like? What was that like being part of something with so many great riders at the time, obviously quite young guys, but clearly guys who were pushing the sport and innovators in the field?
Well, it was an amazing time because everything was so basic and so kind of fundamental, so kind of experimental. Like I remember the very first railing grind that I think maybe was ever done was this pretty nondescript railing in Vancouver, and Dan and Adam Risnar from Universe 1 was there, and we were just looking, and I thought, okay, maybe it's possible to grind and rail on a unicycle. It could be possible. So Dan went and did it, and that was the first. Or even things like rolling hops, being more than just a little thing on the ground. We were downtown again in Vancouver filming Universe 1, and just the idea that you could do that was, it wasn't obvious like it is today. It wasn't at all obvious, and it was just an experiment.
It's hard to put yourself back in that mindset, isn't it? Now,
it's so
you know everything
different.
You know now.
Exactly. Like, to do something like that in the first instance was kind of hard because you didn't have any example to follow. Even paddle grabs, like the first paddle grab that I ever did was kind of an accident. Like I jumped up on something low and stuck on my crank before, and I was trying to get up onto a loading dock, and I thought, okay, well maybe I'll just hook my pedal on it and maybe that might work, and sure enough it did, but it was all a big experiment.
It reminds me of the story of Roger Bannister, who ran the 4-minute mile. No one had done it, and then within a year I think 300 people had done it, and it's just the idea of you see something, you realise it's possible, and then so it's almost like a mental block rather than a physical one. I
think that's pretty helpful, and for me on the mountain unicycling side, it was, I wasn't reinventing the wheel in terms of what was being done on mountain bikes by any stretch, and so living in an environment where I was primarily riding with good freeride mountain bikers and seeing what they were doing was a big inspiration, because then I could just try it and see if it was possible on a unicycle.
So obviously now you're very much into making parts. You've got Kris Holm Unicycles. When did that kind of start for you? When did the idea of making parts come into your head?
It started with just one for me. That was really it, because at the time when I moved to Vancouver and discovered the free riding on the Vancouver North Shore, I didn't. When I discovered the free riding on the Vancouver North Shore, there was no such thing as a commercially made mountain unicycle that could stand up to that kind of punishment. And so I searched around for a machine shop that could make one for me, and kind of went through a crash course in knowing what was possible, and made one. And it cost like $3,000. It weighed about 10 kilograms, and it was stronger than anything probably at the time. And so that was also the start of the internet economy, and that was the other big push. So started with one, unicycle.com started up, so suddenly there was a place to sell them. And I also had some sponsorship support from Norco Bikes at the time, and so they helped me move from that one to something a bit more mass produced, and something made in Taiwan where you could more efficiently make them, and so it grew from there basically.
What do you think has been the biggest innovation in parts so far for you?
I think that the earliest innovations were the most fundamental, in that now unicycles are basically good, and even a mid-range one is good. Sure, an expensive one is better, but they're basically okay. And at the time, so the earlier ones I think were the most fundamental, because it was the difference between something that was viable and something that was crap. And something you could ride and do a drop and not have it break, versus something that you'd wear out 3 sets of cranks in one ride. So the most fundamental is the fact that you can take unicycles and abuse them and they won't break. I think that's been the biggest, and then from there it's been more incremental, making it lighter, making it more ergonomic, thinking of details, making a saddle that's strong and actually comfortable. That's probably another one, especially for the medium distance riding.
In your riding, you've always touched on the fact that you were kind of inspired by the other sports you did and the mountain bikers surrounding you, obviously the area that you lived in. What, for you, would you say has been the biggest inspiration? Maybe not necessarily just in your career as a unicyclist, but also just as a person.
That's a really good question. I've always, I think, kind of two things. In one way, my involvement with music really early on was an inspiration from the perspective that it's tough and you got to practice something repetitively.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the same thing with unicycling. It's very repetitive how you get out there, and you got to have the patience to fail and not have instant gratification. So I think music and learning to play an instrument was a big influence that way for me. And then just a general love of being outside the outdoors. And my own family influences were really big in that sense.
That's great. And last of all, what do you see, which direction do you see the sport going in 10 years? Do you think there'll be any massive innovations? Do you think potentially there could be a larger mainstream audience?
Yeah, I do. I think that there's some pretty good potential, and I think that much of the potential for this sport is for people that don't necessarily specialize in it, that it's not their biggest thing in their life, but they're a skier who likes to ride unicycles sometimes, or a climber that wants to get out on rest days and ride. And so it'll become, I hope, there'll be a much wider base of people riding casually. Right now it's still, even though it's been around for a while now, it's still kind of an early adopter base in a way. It's a more hardcore people that are specialized into it. And so I think it's, the biggest growth probably is outside the competitive field and mostly in people just doing it recreationally.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time, Kris. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason.
And have a good Unicon.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Fantastic.